Welcome to Brown Bag History for October 26, 2022, talking about Revelstoke's Japanese community today. And as we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is traditional Snuneymuxw territory. We acknowledge the ties and claims of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So we did a talk earlier this year on the Japanese work camps, but wanted to talk about the broader Japanese community, and want to acknowledge the research that has been done on this topic by Tomo Fujimura, who really got involved when we started doing commemoration for the 1910 Rogers Pass snowslide, which I'll talk about in a bit more depth in a minute. And he's done tremendous amounts of research trying to connect people who came here in the early 1900s and who worked on the railway with people who were interned during World War II. So, I really owe him a debt of gratitude for all of the incredible work that he's done. And also like to acknowledge my coworker, Harumi Sakiyama, who's our archivist. And the two of us we call ourselves archives nerds, and we go down a lot of rabbit holes and get really excited when we find new connections between things. So we have a lot more information than what I'm presenting today. This is really just kind of a drop in the bucket. It might end up being part one, so we might have to get into the subject again. And there's many families that we're not talking about today, but want to acknowledge that there was a really large Japanese community here at one time, many families here. And as you say, I'm not going to have the chance to acknowledge most of them. But just to put it into a little bit of context, some of the early Japanese settlers started coming in the late 1800s. I think the first recorded Japanese settler is in 1877, but there were many more that started coming in the late 1890s and in the early 1900s. And a lot of them were coming as men, often either single men or married men whose families were still in Japan. So a lot of them were coming to work because they could get jobs here quite easily. There was this photograph shows Japanese laborers in British Columbia. I believe it's possible around North Bend. This is one of the photographs that Tomo was able to find for us. So we know that there were a lot of people coming to work for the railway and in lumber camps as well. Those were the two main areas of employment for the early Japanese settlers. There was a company called the Canadian Nippon Supply Company Limited, and I haven't been able to find out too much about it yet, but I believe that they were both Japanese and Canadian owners of that company. And it says a supply company. What they were supplying was labor. So they were labor brokers for the Japanese workers. So I think most of them were hired through this company. And we have some correspondence in our CPR files that talk about some of the hiring workers. And I apologize that the language used in that is racist language. But they refer to hiring Japanese workers. This was during the war, so there was a labor shortage. So they were really desperate for workers, but the working conditions were quite poor. So they'd hire a crew on, and then the whole crew would quit because the conditions were so poor and the pay was so poor. But that was sort of the reality of a lot of the early people who were working here. We know that there were also some people working, living in Lower Town in the early 1900s. We have census records for 1901 and 1911. In 1901 census, we found 17 Japanese men living at Illecillewaet, all working for the railway, and 2 Japanese men living at Arrowhead. And there were none within the city limits at that time. As I say, we know that there were people living on Front Street in the early 1900s in Lower Town, probably Douglas and Front Street. And but the records are very, very sparse. So it's hard to really get an indication of numbers of how many people were here. One area where we do have a few records is the early city police book, where we know that there were several women from Japan who were working as prostitutes and were being brought in. I talked earlier this year about the story of Jenny Kiyahara, who was murdered in her residence in 1905. And at the time, it mentions her husband, Mr. Fukushima, and another Japanese man who were briefly brought into custody on suspicion of her death and then were let go because there was no evidence that they were involved in her death. But the newspaper at the time mentions other people of the Japanese community and saying that they weren't cooperating with the police, not giving them any information because they didn't think that she was worth hanging a man for. That was language that was actually used in the newspaper. But as I say, the records are sparse. I looked in the BC Vital Events Index from the BC Archives, and we found just through death records, there were 34 Japanese people who died in Revelstoke between 1904 and 1943, and another 12 who died east of Revelstoke, mostly in railway-related accidents. And then that's not included in the 1910 Rogers Pass snowslide, where 32 Japanese men were killed, and I'll deal with that in just a minute as well. But according to the records, approximately 22 of those 34 Revelstoke deaths are buried in Revelstoke, and only about 10 of them had any mention in the newspaper. And it was usually if it was a violent death or railway related accident, there'd be a mention. But in most cases, there's really, like, the newspapers were controlled by the white male English people in the region in Revelstoke. So a lot of news about any ethnic communities was few and far between, and often derogatory when it was in there. There was an incident at Downey, which is Downey Siding, 15 miles east of Revelstoke, not to be confused with Downey Creek north of Revelstoke. Downey Siding was a known slide path and still is. And in April of 1908, 4 Japanese men were killed and 6 injured. The newspaper said the headline said "Avalanche of Death." In the stillness of the middle watches of Sunday night, a CPR work train with a crew of 18 Japanese lay at rest at Downey Siding, 15 miles east of Revelstoke. The inmates of the cars were peacefully slumbering in their berths, totally unconscious of any approaching danger, when suddenly there swept down the mountainside with tremendous velocity a huge snowslide, hurling everything in its path to destruction. The train, consisting of 4 cars, was splintered to matchwood, the unfortunate men being very deep in the snow, 4 of whom were smothered to death and 6 others badly bruised and shaken up. And those men were buried in the Revelstoke Cemetery. They're all recorded there. I think only 1 or 2 of them have markers. So they were, names were K. Kurashito, F. Kurasaka, S. Saito, and D. Aoki. And they were all between the ages of 27 and 39, so young men. So of course, March 4th, 1910 was the largest avalanche event in Revelstoke history in terms of the amount of people who died. So the night of March 4th, 1910, there was a slide had come down east of Rogers Pass, and or a couple of slides had come down. One of them was right at Rogers Pass, right where the arches are right now, right in that area. And a crew was out clearing it because it had stopped the passenger train, and they were out at midnight working. And well, they were in the middle of working. A lot of them were right in what was known as a cut, where the rotary plow had gone through and created this sort of cut where the sort of trench. So a lot of the men were working within the trench, shoveling the snow out. The roadmaster, John Anderson, walked away briefly to call in and say that the slide was almost cleared. When he came back, another slide had come down from the opposite mountain and it buried the crew. He came back and said there was no one there. So 58 men died in that, and 32 of them were Japanese. All of the Japanese bodies were sent to Vancouver for burial and Buddhist services. They had a memorial service in Revelstoke and had a little program for it. And even in the memorial service, they listed the Japanese names separately from the Caucasian workers. Thanks to the research from Tomo Fujimura, we now have information on all of those people. He was able to provide, going through the records at the time, he was able to provide information on each of them, their age, where they were from in Japan, and sometimes a little bit of other detail about them. Tomo actually went to Japan. He met several relatives of the people who had died, and was able to get us additional photographs that we didn't have previously. So now we have this photograph of funeral procession for Masatora Abe, who was one of the workers who lost his life. There's a funeral procession in Vancouver, and the burial at Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver. And this is Masatora Abe. When we did the commemoration, 100th year commemoration here in Revelstoke in 2010, they also did a commemoration at the Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver, and had crane markers made for each of the graves, and planted some trees there as well, and made sure that all of the graves were marked. They also provided crane markers for the 14 burials from that accident that are here in the Revelstoke Cemetery, that some of the Caucasian workers. So that it had a huge impact on the community, and certainly on the Japanese community as well. One of the we were able to use the census records to see who was, what the Japanese population was in the area. So in the 1911 census, there was a lot more names that appear than we'd found in the 1901. At Three Valley, where there was a large sawmill in operation, the Mundy Lumber Company, there were 28 people from Japan, including 2 women and 1 child. And so the men were all working for the Mundy Lumber Company. They also had crews of men from India, and they had separate housing for the people of the different ethnicities. One of the other people who was listed in the census in Three Valley was a man named Masatoro Tamamura, age either 32 or 33, depending on which record you use. And he had come to Canada in 1899, so he was one of the early Japanese immigrants. He married a woman named Una Soga, who was either age 18 or age 22, depending on which record you use. They were married in 1910 at the Oriental Refuge Home on Cormorant Street in Victoria. That home was started by the Methodist Women's Missionary Society in 1888, and it was built as a refuge for Chinese and Japanese women who were working as prostitutes, but it was also used by a lot of the Chinese and Japanese community members as a venue for their weddings. So looking at marriage certificates, most of the weddings, Japanese weddings that happened in Victoria were all held at that home on Cormorant Street. At Taft, there were 12 men. One of them had come in 1896. It was one of the earliest immigrants that I found. There were 40 men at Malacqua. They were working on a bridge project for the CPR. 6 at Arrowhead, working at a lumber mill there, and 34 at Comaplex. And this earlier photograph that we looked at is the mill at Comaplex. And you can see there that there are several South Asian and Japanese workers. So in Revelstoke in the 1911 census, there were CPR boarding cars, which were located just east of Revelstoke. And there were 24 Japanese people listed in that boarding car. And this is the page from the census. One of the people was Kunitara Hashimoto, who's 28 years old. He was listed as a bookman. And the bookman was usually somebody who could read and write English and Japanese, who could speak English and Japanese. And they were hired as the person who would keep records for all of the other workers. So he was working as a bookman. Also in here on the bottom line is his wife, Fude Hashimoto, age 20. That was his first wife. They were married in 1911 at the Oriental Refuge Home, and his address at the time was listed as Revelstoke. So he was already in this area, working in the area. He came to Canada. I was born in 1883, and we know that he was in Revelstoke by 1906. And he was most likely working for that Canadian Nippon Supply Company as a bookman. He was educated and literate. We interviewed his son, Yoshi Hashimoto, earlier this year. And Yoshi said that his father took English very seriously. And he had this huge dictionary, he said, that weighed a ton. He always had his dictionary close by. Kunitaro Hashimoto's first wife died in 1923 at the age of 32. Kunitaro went back to Japan and married Hisa Nishino, and they had 6 children, some of whom were born in Japan and some in Canada. Their son, Kunio Hashimoto, still lives in Revelstoke. And so when they came back, they were living originally, this is the marriage certificate for Kunitaro Hashimoto and his first wife, Fude. So when they first came back, they were living in the boarding cars east of town, and Hisa was a cook for the crew. Yoshi supplied a couple of the photographs of the boarding cars and feeding bears that would come up to their cars. That was quite a common thing. Once they started having more children, they were able to secure a house outside of the city limits on Humbert Street. This was before the war that they purchased the house. But it was a ways back from 4th Street, and at first they didn't have any services. And Yoshi said that they actually had to dig a trench themselves out to 4th Street to connect with the city water supply. The house is still there. That's where the Hashimotos lived for many years. Yoshi said that after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, all of the Japanese workers were pulled off of the railway for security reasons. So his father lost their job, and he said that their large garden really kept them going. And then his father was also able to get work on the McKinnon Standard Dairy Farm, which was below where Downey Street Sawmills is now. And he was then as a flagman for a construction company. Yoshi said that the Catholic nuns who came to Revelstoke around that time in the 1940s, and one of their missions was to work with the Japanese people who were here, and they held English classes for Japanese residents. They also had a lot of the children in their kindergarten classes to make sure to teach the young children English as well. Mrs. Hashimoto later went to Japan to study a massage technique. And Yoshi couldn't remember the name of the specific technique, but it was using pressure points. It was shiatsu, yes, thank you. And she had a practice in her home. One of her clients was the local painter, Sophie Atkinson, and she gave Mrs. Hashimoto several paintings as part of her payment. And Yoshi recently, in the last couple of years, he donated some of those paintings to the museum. And Yoshi himself actually took lessons with Sophie Atkinson as well. So we've got a lot more information on the Hashimoto family, but because I'm just going to try to get all this talk in a short period of time, I'll won't go into it too much right now. One of the other families I did want to mention was the Takahashis, and we haven't talked to anybody from that family yet, and we kind of found out about them in a roundabout way. There was somebody in recently who said that it was not a Japanese person, but said that he was from Kamloops, and he said that probably in the 50s or so, they had a young woman living with them. She was helping out in the family and also going to school. And her name was Hozumi Nakamura, and wanted to know if there was any way of figuring out where she was now. So with a little bit of research, we found out that she had married a man named Sho Takahashi. And then we tracked the Takahashi family back and discovered that they had actually been here quite early. They'd been in Revelstoke before the war. Choichiro Takahashi came to BC around 1908, and he actually ended up working as a section foreman for the CPR. So he actually had quite a good job with the railway. He died of tuberculosis in Tranquil Sanatorium in Kamloops on November 6, 1957. Some of his children were born in Revelstoke, and his father, Shotara Takahashi, also lived in Revelstoke around that same time, and lived in Revelstoke with his son until his death. There was, we found a note in the newspaper about the death of a boy named Eki Takahashi, who died at the age of 16 after a appendix operation. And that was in 1929. Said he'd been born in Japan, but had gone to school here, and had said he was very popular with his schoolmates and was particularly brilliant in school. Another son of Choichiro was Tokutaro, and he died in 1946 at the age of 34, and was working as a baker for Gallicano Bakery. And then another son, Morioso, was actually born in Revelstoke in 1915. He was the son of Choichiro. He was also a bakery for Gallicano's Bakery and actually owned the business for a few years. He had gone back to Japan for a while, and then in 1953 came back with his wife Iku and their children Sho and Ayoko. And Sho lived in Revelstoke until 2007, worked as a mechanic here. And he married Hozumi Nakamura. So there we get back to that original request. So we tracked Hozumi down as being married to Sho. And then I found an obituary for Sho Takahashi just in January of this year. And they'd moved to Burnaby. So we were able to find them there, and I actually found somebody in town who knew them and was able to give us an address. So I haven't yet contacted Mrs. Takahashi, but I'm hoping to do that. But the interesting thing is the Sho and Hozumi lived here for several years, and they raised their children here. So if we track this back, we've got Shotera, his son Chochiro, and his children, including Riozo, and Riozo's children, including Sho, and Sho's children. So there's 5 generations of this one family that lived in Revelstoke at different times. And I haven't been able to find any other Japanese families that have that many, but it made it, and this was just from a random request, that we were able to find all of this information and track this family. So these are some of the markers that are in the Revelstoke graveyard from the Takahashi family. So I'm going to move on now to the outbreak of the war. Before I do that, I just wanted to mention that another record that we found was from the Spanish flu in 1918. There were about 38 people from Revelstoke in the area who died during the flu pandemic, and including 6 Japanese people and 3 members of one family. There was a man named Toshiro Shiaga, who was a section foreman at Twin Butte, and then they also had 2 young sons that died. There was also a woman named Tomi Irene Hashimoto, and I'm not sure how whether she's connected to the other Hashimoto family that was here, but she died as well in that the flu epidemic. So in 1942, after the December 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor, and Canada and the Allies were at war with Japan, there was a decision made in 1942 to remove all Japanese people from the coast, move them outside of what they called the restricted zone. There were camps set up for families. A lot of the camps were in the Slocan Valley and in the boundary area at Tashmi near Hope. And there were also work camps, and I've spoke recently specifically about the work camps, so I won't go into a great deal about that. But there were men's work camps at Three Valley, Griffin Lake, Taft, Yard Creek, Solsqua, and over a period of several years, there were a few hundred Japanese men, most of them young Japanese men who had been born in Canada, who were forced to work in road camps for road upgrades on the Eagle Pass Highway between here and Sicamous. If you're going by Three Valley Gap, there's that little beach there, Rutherford Beach, and a little pullout. There was a sign erected a few years ago to commemorate the camps in the Eagle Pass Valley. But as I say, I did a previous talk on that, so I won't get into too much detail about that one right now. But at that time, there were a lot of families who were able to move independently before they were forced into camps. There were some camp areas that were independent of the government, but there were also quite a few families that moved into around Revelstoke. The city council had a lot of discussions about allowing Japanese people to settle here, and they made a decision and kept affirming that decision that even after being asked to reverse it several times, but they made a decision to not allow any Japanese people who were being forcibly removed from the coast to settle within city limits. The thing that made it possible for Japanese settlers to come here was the fact that the city limits at that time ended at Downey Street. So the west side of Downey Street was in the city limits, the east side was not. And the Big Eddy was also not in city limits at that time. So those were areas where Japanese people were able to come if they could find places that they were able to stay. One of the families that came here and became a really well-known family in Revelstoke were the Wakitas. And Harumi was able to meet with Mas Ora, who is a Wakita, and she's 98 years old now. And she and other family members provided a lot of the photographs that we're seeing right now about the Wakita family. This is Saijiro Wakita, who was originally Saijiro Teranashi. He was born in Miyamura, Wakayama Prefecture, Japan on February 17th, 1887. And his wife, Uno Wakita, was born on August 11th, 1891. Uno was the only child, and Saijiro agreed to carry the Wakita family name, and he changed his name from Teranashi to Wakita when he married Uno. They had 6 daughters, Saruko, Teru, Jitsu, Nobuko, Masayo, and Yaiko, and sons Hajime, or Jim, and Yutaka, or Yuko. They were became really well established in Steveston. They were there in the early 1900s. I think about 1911 or 1912, they came to Steveston and had a general merchant store in Steveston, as well as several other properties. So they were quite well off, doing really well with their business. But in April of 1942, Saijiro and Uno and the 4 younger children, Jim, Mas, Yuk, and Yai, came to Revelstoke under the forced displacement and internment, and their property was confiscated. When they arrived at Revelstoke, they stayed at the boarding house owned by the Takahashi family for 2 weeks before their house was ready to move into. They even though they didn't have to work with the city to come here, they did have to register with the Securities Commission in order to move, and they had to have a place secured before they could move. So they had a place that was being prepared for them on Downing Street. They were originally going to rent a house in the Big Eddy, but they found that there was only an outdoor toilet and no running water. So they were able to rent a house on the south end of Downing Street, near the site of the present Downing sawmills. Mass was age 10 at the time, and she remembered the McKinnon Dairy Farm being quite nearby. They had a strawberry farm for income, 2.5 acre farm on Downing Street, and were there probably on the farm until probably about 1947. They later sold some of their land. They were able to purchase the land later, and then later sold some of it to the land that's now part of Downing Street sawmills. This was their farm on Downing Street. Harumi and I took this photograph out for a little drive last week, and I think it's probably not too far from where the what is the Rotary seniors home? Is that Begbie Court? Begbie Court. Can't remember the name of it, but anyway, it's down in that area and close to that trailer park that's near the near Downing Street as well. So it's down in that area. This is Uno and Saijiro on the steps of their house on Downing Street in the 1940s, and the children. So in at the end of the war, they wanted to purchase property. They wanted to purchase a business building in town, and that was a little bit controversial at the time as well. The city was reluctant to sell property to any of the Japanese, and they actually had a delegation appear before them from the Legion, demanding that they not sell property to any Japanese people or issue any business licenses to Japanese people. It was controversial within the council. The council meetings of June 10th, 1947, they actually read out a letter from the Deputy Minister of Labor at Ottawa and stated that as of January 23rd, 1947, there were no restrictions on Japanese people purchasing property in Canada and they could only refuse a business license on a unanimous vote of council. So the motion was not unanimous. There were 4 on the council who were wishing to refuse business licenses and 2 wishing to allow them. So because they weren't unanimous, they had to issue business licenses to people who were able to get a business license. Yeah, I'll say. So in 1947, and we have the tax records, and we've gone through, and 1947 does appear to be the first year that Japanese people were able to purchase property within the city. So in 1947, Saijiro purchased the former Bregalissi grocery store on 2nd Street East. And that's currently in the property that's now part of Buruski Park on 2nd Street East. They operated as Wakita's general store, although I said for apparently for at least a while, they kept the name Bregalissi on the building rather than putting their own name on it. But it was a real general store. It had dry goods, canned foods, paint, coal oil, work gloves and boots, women's and men's clothing, and other dry goods. The upstairs was an apartment, and they moved in there. They were in operation in that location until about 1965. We're trying to pin the actual closing date of that business, but we think it was around the mid-60s. And then they also opened up another store, the Wakita's Frozen Food Lockers, on 2nd Street West on September 2nd, 1952. And the location of the building is where the beautiful new building has just been built by Pat and Mark McKee on 2nd Street East, across from the Community Connections building. A lot of people will remember that area as the red and white, but the frozen food lockers came first. And that was providing a really important service for the community, because there were a lot of people who hunted, or people who had farms south of Revelstoke, and nobody had sort of home freezers at that time. So it made a real difference for people being able to access a meat locker and being able to rent that space out so that they could preserve their food. The day that they opened, they had they were giving out free frozen food recipe books as well. And then they also had a door prize, and the winner would get a 1-year free locker rent. And they were also having door prizes for turkeys and chickens. And they also sold ice cream and other things there as well. But that was a really big event for the community. So there was an older building there that was that they purchased from the Amano family, and I'll talk a little bit about them a little farther on. So these are pictures from the Wakita family of the frozen food lockers. And they sold meat there as well.
Just didn't know, to build the building that we're building there now, Mark literally had to chip away at concrete so they could put the foundation, the new foundation, because it was the size of the front.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. And then in 1959, they opened up their red and white supermarket, and right next to the frozen food lockers, and kept both going in business for quite a while. So there, of the 4 children that were in Revelstoke, Jim married Mihoko Sakai in 1956 in Revelstoke, and then they moved to Kitimat in 1957 and established a successful building supply store there. But he was involved in the opening of the meat lockers as well until they moved away. And then the younger brother Yuke married Jun Kobayashi in 1954 in Revelstoke. And they had 2 children. They built a house on Burke Drive in Columbia Park. And Uke ran Waukita's General Store and the Red and White until they moved to Vancouver in 1970. That daughter Mass married Bill Ora in Kamloops in 1953, and they moved back to Revelstoke to help Uke run the stores. After Uke moved to Vancouver, Bill and Mass ran the Red and White. They also, for a while, ran the Chuck Wagon restaurant near the Farwell Market. After Bill died in 1987, the Mass and her family continued to run the store until it was damaged by a fire in 1994. And apparently the renter upstairs had a pot operation growing. It was a pot operation linked to fire. But after that, it was run as a bingo hall, and then sold in 2018. Is that correct? Yeah. So Mass is turned 98 years old this year. She's the only surviving member of the Waukita, of that generation of the Waukita family. The youngest daughter, Yai, married Dennis Hayashi on May 2nd, 1956. And Dennis came to Revelstoke in 1947 to visit his cousin Fuji Sakayama and decided to stay here. Dennis and Fuji both worked for Pratolini Construction, and they bought the business. And we just found out recently that what helped them buy the business was a loan from Mr. Saimoto, who's another family that was here during the war. They bought Rogers Ladies Wear on 2nd Street East, the beer house location, and named it Gail Jean Ladies Wear. They purchased that in 1972. And then when the Alpine Village Mall opened in 1977, they opened Dasby Fashions women's clothing and Style Trend men's clothing. And Style Trend moved to its current location they were there by 1986. Gail Jean closed around 1983, and Dasby was eventually purchased by Lisa Sameo, who just closed it this year. And we're not sure when you purchased Style Trend.
81.
81, okay.
Yeah, 81, 82,
But Dennis, Mark was looking for a job in Victoria and saw a card on the Manpower wall for a store here, and Dennis Yashi and Yai are the reason we moved to Revelstoke.
Oh, wow.
And then we ended up buying Style Trend from that.
Okay,
And
neat.
Ron showed you was also in one.
Okay, neat.
So if it wasn't for this family, we would.
That's amazing.
You know how Daphne was named? Dennis, Allison, Stewart, Patsy, and Yai.
Okay. So another connection that we made, that we discovered this year, that really astounded us, and this was got an email from Tomo, who has, as I said, has done so much research, and he was reading some documents on the work camps and came across this information on a young man who had died in New Year's Eve of 1943 when his truck plunged into Three Valley, and I'd never heard anything about that account before. So we did a little bit of research. I found the note about it in the paper, and it said I first assumed he was probably at one of the work camps, but it said he was 20-year-old Japanese youth of the city whose parents live on Downey Street, and mentioned that he was drowned when his truck went into the water. He was actually with 3 other men from Revelstoke, and they were returning to town, and his body was never recovered. But through that, we started doing some digging. I did some looking in the newspaper and in the phone books, and I found some information on the Amano family, and then found a note in the newspaper talking about their soy manufacturing company. And that one blew me away. I had no idea that there'd been a soy manufacturing company in Revelstoke, but it was where you just built your new building, where the meat lockers had been. That was I don't know, we don't know whether Mr. Amano built it or whether it was a building that was already there that he purchased. But he was able to, when he was able to purchase land in 1947 in town and get a business license, that's the building that he bought and was running a soy and miso manufacturing company there. They had a younger son and a younger daughter, Mio and Shigeru. Shigeru went to school in Revelstoke, and we were able to track, we have all of the high school annuals, and Harumi has scanned all of our high school annuals. So we were able to track him, and found out that he graduated in Revelstoke in 1950 and was the valedictorian that year. So a very smart boy, and it said in his grad profile that he wanted to be an architect, and he did become an architect. But the family moved back to probably 1951 was when they sold the property to Wakita's, and they moved back to the coast, and they are still running the Amano Miso Company. And it was 1949. The boy who died, Noburo, had actually been sent back to Japan to learn the process. And then when he came to Canada, the family started the company. And then of course assets were sold underneath them when they were forced out of the coast. And then eventually they reestablished the business, and it's still running today. We had a visit earlier this year from Graham and Linda Amano. Graham is the son of Shigeru. Sorry, there are too many names in my head. They brought miso and teriyaki sauce for me and Harumi when they came. But he said that his father never talked about Revelstoke. They really didn't know anything about their time here. So I was able to actually show him where the building was, where his dad had gone to high school, and give them information from the high school annuals. So it was really neat to be able to make that connection from absolutely not knowing anything about that family or anything about having the company here to now having a connection with them. So that's what really excites us when we're doing this kind of research, is being able to make those connections. The Wakita family has a lot of photographs that include some of the other Japanese people. So there's Mas Wakita with Miyoko Amano, so that's Shigeru's sister. And we've got other members like the Janucci family, Fukuyama, and the Saimotos. And recently had an interview with a member of the Saimoto family. Talk about that in a bit. There's Yuki Wakita with Shigeru on his back playing in the snow. So we found a lot of connections between the families. Also, I want to talk a little bit about sort of involvement in the community. Yuke was a member of the Spikes baseball team, which was a well-known local baseball team. They was also part of the Revelstoke high school basketball team. I think this was can't remember this, Saimoto back here. And this is Yuke Wakita. That's Paul Salva. Peter Grauer was the teacher at the time. Bill Husband. That's Bill Husband. Okay. Yeah. So we've found found lots of young people in the high school annuals. Several of them were valedictorians. This is George Fukuyama. We haven't really done any research into his family yet. But this is a picture of Jim Wakita and the Boys Cooking Club. So we've got Donald Janucci, George Fukuyama, Jim Wakita, and Teru Sakaki, all in the Boys Cooking Club. It seemed to be pretty popular. This was an interesting story. This Don Janucci was in high school in the 1940s, And this was this at the Nikai Center? They had this lunchbox donated that had belonged to Donald Masayuki Janucci when he attended school in Revelstoke, and it's now in the collection of the Nikai Museum. Now, here's Ryoshi Hashimoto, who we interviewed. And as I said, he was born in Revelstoke and raised here. His family was one of the early families that had come here before the war. Said he planned to be a secondary teacher. He was a teacher for all of his career until he retired, lives at the coast now. And his sister, Mary Hashimoto, was also the valedictorian. We recently did an interview with a man named Shigeo Saimoto, who's the younger brother of Hisao and Mikio Saimoto. They went to high school here. Shigeo went to elementary school here and I think left before he would have entered high school. But Shigeo ended up as a professor emeritus of Queen's University in metallurgical engineering. The family, when they left, were forced to leave the restricted area. They originally went to a place called Minto, which was a ghost town near Lillooet. And it was an independent camp, not run by the government. But they came to Revelstoke in May of 1945 to be nearer to their sister Nobuko, who was in they had a tuberculosis sanatorium at New Denver, and the sister was there. So when they came here, they lived in a house owned by Alf Grauer on 4th Street near Moss. It's near where we live now. But apparently, Mr. Grauer was initially reluctant to rent to them, but Mr. Kunimatsu Saimoto showed Mr. Grauer that he had purchased war bonds and that he supported the Allied efforts in the war. So then Mr. Grauer agreed to rent him a house. They later bought a house a block closer. This was in advertisers in the high school annuals. So there's Mrs. Janucci who had electric treatment, and I'm not sure what that was. The Wakita's, the Bregalissi Grocery, the Amano Miso Company, and Nishi, which was a company out of Kamloops, and then the Snow White Laundry for the Shoji family. These were some photographs that were donated to the museum several years ago by a man named Stan Imada, and that's him in the photograph. And he said, our family lived in Big Eddy from 1942 until 1946. My father, Morio Imada, worked on the CPR section gang. My older brother, Tom, went to school in a small one-room schoolhouse in Big Eddy. In the winter, he would go up in the morning to start the fire in the school stove. In the summer, he worked for Mrs. Griffith, who let him ride a horse to bring in the cows. I was only 2 when we arrived in Revelstoke. I do recall chasing frogs in the slough behind our house. We lived in 2 houses during our stay. One was a shack with an outhouse and outdoor well just down the hill from the school. The second house was larger and had a kitchen sink and a hand pump. It was belonged to the Parker family. That for my parents, these were hard times, but my brother and I have only fond memories of our life there. And he said, here are some of the pictures I have of our days back then. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the Shoji family. They were definitely really prominent in the community for many years. The Snow White Laundry originally opened in 1945 on the site where the Woolsey Creek Cafe is now. And at that time, I think it was that he had a partner in the business. So the partner had the business, owned the property and a business license. And then in 1947, they moved to Victoria Road, where the Cheers Beer and Wine store is now. Mr. Shoji, Roy Shoji was an alderman from 1965 to 1968. He had been the founder of the Vancouver Paper Box Company in Vancouver in 1929. And then before that, it was proprietor of a box factory in Tokyo. Yoshoji, who many people will still remember, was by 1974. This is when we got a lot of this information from a special edition they had in the Revelstoke Herald. Said that he'd graduated from Kitsilano High School and did a Pittman's business course, and did a lot of management courses in Maryland, and then came here to take over the Snow White Laundry. And he was also an alderman for the city for a few terms. I'm it's probably getting a little late here, but just wanted to mention a man named Mike Maruno, who actually ended up in the Baseball Hall of Fame as a member of the Asahi baseball team. And he married Eleanor Tsuchiya. And I probably won't talk about the Tsuchiyas today because I've been talking a long time. But the Tsuchiyas was another family that came here during the war and settled in Big Eddy. And they became really prominent community members and were really well known and revered in the community. And there was even a note in the newspaper when they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. But their one daughter married Mike Maruno, and they moved to Toronto. But he was a member of the Revelstoke baseball team for quite a while as well. There he is right here. And this is his wife, Eleanor Tsuchiya Maruno. Of course, seeing that Harumi helped me so much, I have to mention her father-in-law, Fuji. Fuji was another person who came to Revelstoke in 1942. He was actually making boats for a while, as large as 32 footers. He and Dennis Hayashi bought the building supply company of the Pratolinis. And as I mentioned, we found out when we talked to Mr. Seimoto that Mr. Seimoto's father had given them the loan that enabled them to start their building supply company. So the Revelstoke Builder Supply was started by Fuji and by Dennis. And at this time, this is 1974, they were in the building that's now the Padrino's Pizza at the corner of Connaught and First Street. And of course, he still has had four children. The son Glenn is still in town and does Battersby's Plumbing. This is something that we haven't been able to find a lot of information about, but we know that there was a Japanese Canadian Citizen Association here for several years. One note in particular that I found about them was regarding the golf club. In 1942, the local golf club had made a motion that Japanese people, regardless of citizenship, were denied playing privileges on the Revelstoke golf course. They ratified that vote in 1947. And then their minutes say that in 1949, they had a request from the Japanese Canadian Citizens Association to asking them to allow their members to be allowed to play golf. So they had a vote on April 6, 1947, with 27 members present. And there were still 3 of those members that did not want to allow Japanese people to play on the golf course, but the majority of the members at that time, they rescinded the motion. So it opened it up. So they were active. We're not, as I say, we haven't been able to find too much about their activities in town. We do know that when the Tournament of Champions was on in the 1950s and 60s, that they often had Japanese skiers coming, and they would have like a big event, like a talent show, and that at some of those, the local Japanese association was involved in in putting on some entertainment as part of those celebrations. There was actually a visit of the Crown Prince Akihito in Revelstoke in 1953. He was only here for about 20 minutes. That's what often a lot of these visits were, just, quick stops while the train was here. But the local Japanese community came out in force to greet him. And there's the Mayor Walter Hardman, who's mayor here for about 25 years, was there as well. Also recognized the RCMP officer, John Murdoch, who was here for quite some time. But those are some of the local Japanese members who made sure that they were out there to welcome the Crown Prince. So, as I say, we've got so much information. This is really just a drop in the bucket. But a big part of putting this together was to compile this information and to do this research. And we're going to continue to do it. There's a lot of people that I still want to interview, and still more information to compile. There's more rabbit holes to go down. But just wanted to mention a couple of sites if you want to learn more. There's a site put together through, I know they work closely with UVic, called Landscapes of Injustice. And as part of that, they have a research database, and they have included all of the documents regarding all of the people who were forcibly removed from the coast. So all of that information is available there. Also, I'd encourage you to have a look at the Nikkei Museum in Vancouver and see what they have available. And it looks like I've got a chat here. So let's see. This is Laura Saimoto. So this is the niece of Shigeo Saimoto, who we interviewed. And Laura was really instrumental in getting that sign that I mentioned at the Three Valley Lake. Laura says, this research is really well done. Thank you very much, Kathy and Harumi, from Laura Saimoto in Vancouver, Sai Saimoto's daughter and Shig Saimoto's niece. It is so wonderful to see the photos of our family friends during Revelstoke times. Revelstoke definitely holds a special place in our family's hearts. Thanks, Laura. It's always good to work with you too, and we really enjoyed the interview with you and your uncle. Thank everybody for coming today. The next Brown Bag History in 2 weeks is going to be on the Scandinavian community. So thanks again for everybody who joined us today.